Everyone, it's Will. Now, one of the statements that I've heard being said in the past about your 20s is your 20s are the best years of your life. And that statement, it always frustrates me if I'm being completely honest, because my first thought when I hear that is, so does that mean everything else goes downhill from here? And in today's video, we're going to look at this idea and break down this belief to recognize all the growth that comes in your 20s and the excitement that does come with your 20s, while also being able to take away the pressure that some people might be putting on you to have the best decade of your life. So the goal of this video is to allow you to recognize that there isn't just one path. It's not a one size fits all. One person might say their 20s were the best, and that's completely fine. Other people might say that their 30s might have been the best, while others might be talking very fondly of their 60s and their 70s. And none of those are inherently wrong. But when we hear things like your 20s are the best decade of your life, I think we run into some problems. So this video is here to calm you down and go easier on yourself. Now, before we get into this further, a quick note as someone who is 24 years old, I think one of the biggest challenges that a lot of people in this stage of life face is just trying to navigate everything on their own. So having people around you to push you to stay consistent, to think bigger, and to continue growing can make a huge difference, especially during periods of uncertainty or transition. And that's a big reason why communities like our mentorship school community can be so valuable. So if you're looking for more accountability, more support in a group focused on career growth, relationships, and personal development, you can check it out in my bio. And I also mention it in the description for this video. Now back to the topic. Why I think this statement can be very misleading and sometimes anxiety provoking for 20-somethings is that we hear people older than us saying that this decade should be, the most exciting time of your life, when really you might be going through a lot of growing pains. And then you start thinking, well, I must be doing something wrong if it's not the most exciting time of my life or the best decade of my life. And another thing that it does is it at least makes me think, so does everything get worse from here? And personally, I don't want my 20s to be the best years of my life. And you might feel the same way. And what I'm starting to see, though, is that this decade is incredibly transformational, whether through those great experiences or very difficult experiences that are almost like a coming of age. And we have more freedom during this decade than we will in other areas of our lives or other times in our lives. And I think with that comes a lot of excitement. But attaching absolutes to a decade that might not hold the same level of fondness across the board for different people isn't always helpful. Because during this time, you're getting your first jobs, you're learning how to pay your own bills, figuring out how to live life outside of the structured school schedule. You're starting to see that time is moving faster and faster. You're able to go to that concert or that sports game without having the responsibility to care for, your family just yet. You're able to start making career decisions based on what you want to pursue, and that's incredibly exciting. And you're also seeing relationships transform, and you might start to see some of those friendships fade away. And there's so many firsts in this decade, which comes with a lot of angst, but also a lot of excitement. But the reality is that everyone has their own experiences. Some people might look back on their 20s and say that that decade was filled with a ton of freedom, excitement, a lot of uncertainty, many growing pains. And I might not look back on my life and say that this was my favorite decade, but it was a very unique and memorable one for me. Whereas other people, they might be saying, my 30s were a lot of fun, but my 20s were all over the place. I wasn't settled in my career. Everything going on in my life seemed like it was the end of the world. I was doing a lot of building in all the different areas of my life. And I'm really enjoying my 30s because I'm able to see the rewards that came from the tough decade in my 30s or in my 20s. Sorry. Now, other people, they might be thinking, my 20s were incredibly difficult, exciting, great learning experience. Then in their 30s, some real life events come up that were very difficult, very stressful. And then they look back on that as a very trying time. But then their 40s brought a sense of ease because they felt like they had overcome a lot in their 30s. And then more peaceful times were had during their 40s. So this isn't to say that people who look back on their 20s as being the best decade of their life is being a bad thing, because that isn't a bad thing. But I think where we reach that issue is when people say that your 20s are the best years of your life. Being able to say that the 20s were the best years of my life, I think is a different story, because it doesn't at least put the pressure on other people to feel like they need to have the best time in this decade when they might be going through a lot of growing pains. So the point of this is that if you're a 20 something and you're looking all around and thinking this doesn't always feel easy, this is stressful, and you start feeling bad when someone says your 20s are the best years of your life and thinking that you're doing something wrong, please remember that everyone has their own path. And what's the case for one person doesn't need to be the story for you. We're all on unique journeys that make it incredibly difficult to say this is something across the board. So with that, be easier on yourself. Know that you can be having an exciting decade. You can be having a nerve-wracking decade, an uncertain decade, a decade filled with learning, an independent decade, which is exciting. And all those experiences are completely valid. And that's what's so exciting about life. It's unique for every single person. So as we wrap up here today, as I mentioned earlier, your 20s can be very exciting, confusing, overwhelming, and uncertain all at the same time. And trying to navigate everything on your own can make it even harder. So if you're looking for more accountability, support, and a group of people focused on growing in areas like career, relationships, and personal development, check out our mentorship school community built around the Kindling program in the description below. And I also mention it in my bio. But thanks again for watching, everyone, and I will see you next time.